Ooh. All right. All right, if you guys wouldn't mind grabbing a seat, we're going to get started. As soon as we get everybody kind of back in the room and seated, we'll get kind of launched in the next session here. Julian, could you let them know we're getting fired up? All right. Thank you, Gavin and Al, and thank you, John. That was fascinating. We definitely need to figure out a way to follow up on John's experiment in January and hear how that goes. All right. Is that everybody, Joy? You guys could just find your way to the tables. We'll get this kind of second session kicked off and rolling. Well, my name is Justin Elam. I'm the Associate Director of Partnerships, and it really is just an honor for our team to have you in town. We recently went through the Story Brand book by Donald Miller, and one of the things it talks about in that book is, you know, to look at your customers as heroes and of your story. And of course, and he's writing that book for the marketplace, and he's thinking about, you know, how do you get people who really what you want from them is for them to swipe their credit card? How do you turn them into your heroes? And one of the things that was so fun for our team was, like, the people we serve, you, your churches, your staff, you know, you really are our heroes. You're the people that we totally admire, we totally look up to. We're just amazed at what you do because it's so hard what you do. And so it's for you guys to come in town and be around us and for us to serve you is just such an honor and a privilege and a pleasure. So thanks for coming. Thanks for making time. I know you're super busy. Christmas season is super busy for all of you, and we really appreciate you being here. I just wanted to take just a few minutes because I'd heard some comments, both, you know, first, second, and third hand from different leaders, and those comments were kind of made me feel like, okay, it's been a while since we've really talked about and clarified kind of how we feel about this whole partnership thing, meaning the partner team, how we view it and how we see it. And there were a couple comments where, in particular, some people maybe said on a group call or something, they'd say something like, well, I know this isn't the way North Point does it, but we're going to try this. And it was almost said in a way that they were worried about sharing openly that they were doing something different than North Point. And there were versions of that I thought, you know what, I have done a really poor job of sharing kind of some clarity around where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So I just wanted to take a few minutes today as we kick off the second session to do that. 14 years ago, Partners started in 2004. And when it started, the launch of Partnership was really more around conformity to the North Point model. And it was North Point was the bullseye. And so churches were sort of measured primarily against how close they were to sort of that level of compliance. And so if you were a partner church, for the most part, you were expected to show Andy as your primary communicator. There were a whole series of things that were really almost as close to 100% alignment with not just North Point's mission, vision, and values, but actually its programming. And that's how churches were, again, they were measured against that. And there were nuances and variations of that, but approximation to North Point was really the expectation in the original launching of the partner model. And 14 years ago, North Point was in a very high growth season, and that sort of conforming approach, approximation approach made more sense. But in that 14 years, North Point has gone through the same path, is undergoing the same path that all organizations travel. And you recognize that path because it's the path of all organizations. And it's just that irrefutable, unavoidable organizational S-curve that describes every organization and every time in every industry and every place. And timelines vary and seasons of growth vary, and there's all kinds of variables that affect how long each of these seasons are, but eventually every organization goes through this, and North Point itself is going through this. And so what was a high growth phase at the beginning of partnerships, now North Point is entering more of that maturity phase. And in that maturity phase, growth still happens, but it slows down. And one of the most important aspects of realizing you're in that maturity phase is that the importance of innovation is absolutely heightened in that phase. And we know this because if you look at how organizations survive long-term, and all of you know this, but if there's any longevity in an idea or a model or an organization, it's because that organization reinvented itself over time. And in the marketplace, what happens is if a company does not do that, then a newer, more nimble company with a better idea just takes their place and executes that idea until they go on the growth curve. And after they've done that, they're replaced by another thing. And so you can even see that in some ways in the North Point story. If you look at North Point's story and you hear Andy and the people that founded this ministry talk about it, Andy will often talk about the fact that it was that group sitting in a conference hosted by Willow Creek where they saw and were given permission and even inspired by what Bill Hybels and Willow Creek had done, and that sort of carried them and gave them permission to launch another version of what we're doing. And so that is true in that situation, but now we're entering that maturity phase and we're talking about reinvention. And that needs to happen again. And one of the hopes, so that you know, for the partner network is that this network is actually the incubator for that reinvention, whatever it should look like. And that the relationship that we desire is to be in relationship with those innovators. One of the things I've thought about in that story with Willow Creek and North Point is, what if Willow Creek had a situation where they weren't just bringing in leaders and inspire them to do some version of what they were doing? What if they had been in relationship with Andy and the leadership team from day one? And what if they had been able to benefit from those discoveries and experiments and innovation that were happening? How might that have benefited Willow? I don't know. But when we see that and we think about that, that's our desire. Our desire is to take whatever this version of this model of church is and invite in many, many different leaders who are like-minded, and in that process, be in relationship with those innovators so that we can all grow together. And again, in maturity phase, what we know is that innovation is at a premium because you can't wait till the decline phase to innovate. That's when most companies are in panic mode and they try to innovate, but we know from just all the research and studies of organizational life cycles that is very difficult, if not impossible, to recover at that point. You have to remake yourself in that maturity phase when you're doing well. And so it's possible that that innovation will come in part from what's happening at North Point and its campuses. Innovation is a huge part of the culture here. You all know that. You heard Gavin and Al talking about trying to innovate and figure out new problems. There's lots of experiments going on at the campuses and NPM level in North Point. And our hope is that drives greater innovation and remaking when necessary and extends the life cycle. But it's just as likely, and maybe even more likely, that innovation is going to come from this room and other people's that will hopefully join this room. In fact, when Andy opened Woodstock City Church, the new building there, he talked to our staff about this. And one of the quotes that he said was from a guy named Al Reese, who wrote a book called Focus. And what he said was, the next generation product almost never comes from the previous generation. And that quote was used in context to tell our staff, we absolutely need to not settle and not become complacent in whatever God has already done here, but we need to be the best students we've ever been. And what partnership represents to this organization is not only to be students, but to be in relationship with the teachers, the people that are innovating and doing that. And that's what makes the power of this network so exciting for us, is that it has the potential for not just one person or one church or one staff to become the next thing, but for all kinds of micro innovation to happen to raise, the rising tide raise all ships idea. So our goal is to gather as many like-minded leaders who are innovating and experimenting in all kinds of different contexts, learn from them, pass those learnings along to one another, and grow together. And because of that, the partner strategy was evolved and reshaped to accommodate that, to create a greater opportunity for that innovation. And the first step in that was to go from what does it look like to be 100% conform to the North Point model to the other end of the spectrum, which is what is the irreducible minimum of what the North Point model is? The mission, the vision, the values, the key practices. And so Lane led the team through about a year of reducing from 100% down to the smallest circle that we felt like maintained the integrity and the distinctive of what this was. Because we knew that beneath that circle, it would lose its distinctive and the helpfulness of discussion would begin to deteriorate. But above that circle, you would have all kinds of room to innovate, and you'd have leaders all over that spectrum. So again, below that, once we distilled the core, we realized, okay, below this distinctive, that's where we lose, kind of the discussion becomes too ambiguous. Above it is where innovation. Now we thought, now we can invite in churches all up and down that spectrum. And they can innovate from wherever they are in whatever context. They're free to adopt or not adopt things if they don't find them helpful. But to us, what partnership represents then is hundreds of R&D labs in contexts all over the country and all over the world, Lord willing, and us being able to monitor and learn from. You heard John present today just some really interesting things that North Point isn't doing or isn't doing yet. But those kinds of ideas and being able to curate those ideas and pass them along to the network so that we all get better. So in this room, what we have is we have churches at all levels. And they're free to adopt as much as North Point as they want or not. If you're like, hey, 95% of what North Point is doing makes sense in our context, then great. If it's significantly less than that, then great. Innovation can come from anywhere. Just because a church is sort of very, very close to the way North Point does things doesn't mean that they lack for the ability to innovate. In fact, probably the most innovations I've seen North Point and its campuses adopt have come from churches that are really, really close. And it doesn't hurt you whether you're close or whether you're further away from that 100% mark. Innovation can come from anyone, from anywhere. The real question for us is whatever North Point's doing or whatever you're doing, when you're a church leader and you look out at this entire network of churches, what is the answer to the question, what is the most strategic and helpful way of creating a church that unchurched people love to attend and engage with in your community? And if the answer to that question is something North Point is doing, great. If it's something that one of your peers is doing in the network, great. But that allowed for us to maximize the diversity. And a lot of you are sitting in this room because this is how the model changed. And you weren't interested in that first iteration, but you were far more interested in participating in this innovation, in this version. And we think that diversity is our strength. But it's also why that irreducible minimum point is so, so important to us. We're probably stricter about that now than we've ever been, because what we realize is if we don't maintain that standard, the value of this begins to be diluted. And so what happens is there are way more churches that want to be in this room in this conversation than we say yes to. We probably say no or not yet about 70% of the time to churches that want to be here because it's so important. We feel not only a burden, but the importance of guarding this room so that it can become an incubator for innovation around an idea that people are truly like-minded in attempting to execute. So my hope was to help you see and bring clarity to that. And I hope that idea excites you, but you might be thinking, that sounds great, but I'll just tell you as somebody on the other end of this thing, it feels really North Point heavy to me. And if that's how you feel, that's exactly how I would expect you to feel, in part because this was a network that is launched from North Point. And so the vast majority of the content to launch it is North Point's ideas, North Point content, North Point's learning. It's a lot of what attracted you. You want to know what North Point is doing and thinking. But after a while, when you learn that, you want to hear other ideas. But in this early stages, as we've changed, and this new kind of orientation has only been a couple years old, to be honest, the ideas and the majority of our content is North Point related. So it can feel to you like North Point is at the center of all of it. But I want you to know that's not how we see it. How we see it is that the idea is at the center, and North Point is a significant voice in that conversation. But ideas should flow to and from that whole spoke, that whole wheel, and pass in between churches. So when our team, runs into your staff or talking to your leadership, and we kind of run into this, like, hey, I'm not doing it the North Point way, but this is working for us. We have adopted an expression to try to address that, which is innovation is not a problem. Innovation is the point. And we try to say that just to encourage, and I would want you to spread that to your staffs as well, is that innovation is not a problem. Innovation is the point. And I want you to feel the freedom to do that. And that's really important because at times, sometimes the partner team, we feel like if you don't see it the way we see it, or you see it as North Point is this center of the spoke, then when we visit your church or we talk to you, it can sometimes feel like you're getting a visit from the health inspector. And it's like, hey, are the bathrooms clean? Is the kitchen clean? What kind of health grade am I going to get posted in the window? And that's not all of you, but we feel that. And we're trying to dismantle that because it's important for us that we not be viewed that way. We view ourselves more as air traffic control, and that we sit in the tower and we monitor the churches and we see what people are trying and experimenting with. We look into North Point and we see all the best ideas that are coming from North Point, and we look out into the network and we try to constantly make connections, whether it's ideas or whether it's relationships. We're sitting there in that sort of concierge position, and when you say, hey, I'm about to build a building and it's about this size and scope, is there anybody in the network that's kind of a year ahead of me on this that I can learn from? Yes, that's our job. That's what we see our job is managing that sort of crossroads of ideas and people and learning who you are and what you've learned and finding ways to connect you to each other. And that's the value we hope to provide increasingly. So what can you do? How can you help? Well, number one, I would just ask you to be patient. It's going to take time for us to build the systems and do the things to curate the great ideas. But over time, we see the voice of the partnership network increasing as a part of this whole system. It just takes time to get there. And so if you can be patient with us for that discovery phase and that curation phase and that deployment phase, we're making progress. And hopefully you see that even in this event today, that you see we're having partners get up just as often as anyone from North Point or its campuses. The second thing I would ask you to do is just share your ideas. Anything you're experimenting with, anything you're trying, please pass them along. Just email whoever you know on our team, hey, we tried this thing, we're getting ready to try this thing. Pass those ideas along. Don't keep them secret. Don't feel like we're going to feel like, oh, that's not the North Point way. We want to hear everything you're doing, and pass along what you're hearing on your group calls and other things. When you see anything either inside our network or outside our network that you think there is something this church is doing, whether it's, again, inside or outside, that we think can help us get us to this goal, pass that along so that we can sort of figure out how to package that and push that back out so everybody benefits. And the last thing I would say is spread the word. Tell your staff, this is what the partnership's vision is. This is what their desire is. So let's participate. So it's not just something that we're curating at a leadership level, at a lead pastor level, but at every level of what we're doing, there's this value of shared ideas and all ships rising together. And I would say spread the word and invite like-minded leaders. Anyone that you know that you think is like-minded and would fit in this room and fit at these tables, that would benefit from hearing this and being a part of this, and would benefit all of us by sharing what they're learning, please make introductions. Because really, our favorite way to add partners to this thing is to add the people that you know already would fit. Because that's a whole lot easier for you to say, I understand what we're trying to do, I understand this room, I understand where we're going, and this person needs to be a part of that. So, having said all that, I hope that's a little bit clearer, and I'm going to go ahead and move on. This next section, we're going to talk a little bit about generosity and giving, and we have two leaders that are going to do that. Patrick Ballington is going to come up first. He's the lead pastor of the Bridge Church in Cleveland, Georgia. And Again, all of you have areas of interest and expertise and passion. One of Patrick's many areas of expertise and passion is in this area of generosity and giving. He's done consulting on that. And again, this is one of those ideas when we see somebody who's passionate, has a great idea, we say, hey, kind of share your learning with the group. So would you please welcome up Patrick Ballington.
What a incredible honor and opportunity to do this. It's a little intimidating with you guys because you guys are also my hero and I learned so much from you guys. We all know that generosity is God's plan for funding the mission and the vision of the church. However, here's a stat that may surprise some of you. On average, 15% of your attenders contribute 50% of the income, and 50% or more are actually giving nothing, or statistically nothing, perhaps maybe $500 a year or less. Now, that's pretty shocking to some people. In fact, North Point Churches, what I have found in our network is that the number's even higher of people who do not give. It can be 60 and even close to 70% in some churches. And that may be alarming, but it should be expected whenever we are reaching unchurched people, that a large number of people in our congregations are not givers and they're not participating, at least financially, in the mission and the vision. But remember, our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Christ. And so there's a discipleship component and there's a transformation that needs to take place. And generosity is a measurement of spiritual growth. I mean, how do we tangibly, visibly measure and quantify somebody's spiritual growth? And generosity is one of those. And so it's a very important discipleship component that we really need to have in our churches and we need to be more intentional about. You've all heard it said, we're never more like Jesus than when you love, serve, and give. So when we talk about giving, how we talk about it should be transformational, not transactional. Giving should always be about spiritual transformation, not just a financial transaction that's taking place. Generosity begins in the heart, not in the wallet. Okay, so there has to be something taking place in the heart that we need to be able to identify with, and as pastors, that's our greatest concern. So people should feel that they need to have a conversation with God about their giving before they even have a conversation with their spouse or with their accountant or with their bookkeeper. Okay, by the time they hear us talk about giving, they should be compelled to get on their knees, not get out a calculator. But a lot of times we just focus sometimes on the transaction that needs to take place or the amount that we have to raise or whatever the gap is that we're trying to close. So our approach and our conversations, again, should always focus on the spiritual dynamics that's taking place in their lives rather than the financial amounts. But the reality is both are important because when you're trying to do a new ministry or you're building a new building, the dollars matter, okay? So we can't just kick that to the side. We just need to make sure that as pastors, we don't become glorified fundraisers, that we actually maintain our pastor's calling and heart for life change. So our primary goal is to help align their habits with their newly inspired hearts, okay? So there's a lot of ways we do that. We've already talked about, seasons of generosity and little ideas that we have that would spike. In fact, many of us just kind of came out of the Be Rich season. Our church did that, and man, it was awesome that, we get to bring all the organizations in the way we do it at our church. We bring them in, they're on the stage, and we're handing out checks, and we're giving out crazy money, and man, that's just a thrill, and that's wonderful. But a season of generosity does not automatically lead to a culture of generosity. Okay, that's a moment. And Be Rich is a great example of that. But what you really need to have is a robust stewardship system that is developed for your church and that's in place before you have, the campaign or before you have the initiative. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that initiative will create a spike. Okay, it'll increase your giving, but eventually that will kind of shrink back. And in some cases, it will shrink back lower than what normal was before. And so the curve gets really steep and you go, man, what happened? I thought we turned a corner. But you really need to have this robust stewardship system in order to create a culture of generosity. And then the campaign, whether it's a building campaign, whether it's a Be Rich campaign, whatever it may be, that then becomes the catalyst to start the conversations and really to put the system into action. So this compelling cause, again, it can spike, but if you want to have consistent generosity, and you want to see heart change, life change that ends up in financial change, then it's really the result of three motivations or three motivators that are all working together. So here's the primary motivators for generous giving. First of all, relationships, and specifically relationships with church leadership. And by church leadership, I mean with your senior leaders, with like the senior pastor, or with a lead communicator, or with a campus pastor, or maybe the board. Okay, and I realize as your church is growing, and some of us have large churches, it's impossible to have real and meaningful relationships with everyone. So I'm talking about real relationships, somebody you go out to eat with, go see a movie with, or God forbid, go on vacation with. Okay, close relationship. Or it can be perceived relationships. And the perception from someone who's sitting in a congregation is asking themselves, are they approachable? Are they relatable, right? Are they accessible? Can I even meet with them if I wanted to, or at least just have a conversation or bump into them in the hallway? In other words, it may not be a real relationship, but if they see you at the grocery store, can they approach you? And if not, then you've got a relationship issue, because relationship is a key motivation. It's why relationships with staff members or relationship with growth group leaders, it needs to be with someone that they see as a leader within the church. That is a key motivation for people's giving to an organization. Do they have a relationship with some leader at some level? And then there's a capacity for financial margin, their capacity to give. Right? And this could be, again, real capacity. In other words, there's excess. They've got more income, or they've got more stored resources than they have expenses going out. So that's real capacity. But it can also be their ability or their willingness to adjust their budget, make some financial changes, some lifestyle changes to create margin or to create some capacity. One of the things that really influences that is their faith connected to their finances. For instance, you remember the story of the widow's mite, right? The lady who gave her last 2 little coins. Here's someone who had, from our perspective, zero financial capacity. But because of her faith, and she's looking, through a God-centered lens, and because she is so bought into the activity of God and the redemptive activity of God, she made some really tough sacrificial decisions and created a capacity that we would have said didn't even exist. So we're talking about real excess and capacity, or at least the ability to create that. And then the last one's affinity. Affinity is huge. It is, how much have they bought into the church's mission and vision? And it goes beyond that. It's also a shared sense of values. It's our shared values that make us feel like family more than anything else. So do they share the same values? Do they have confidence that our strategy and how we're going about ministry is effective and will work? It's also the brand. Is our reputation out in the community and with the church positive? Is that true also of the leaders? Last and least in this case is doctrine. What we have realized is people will suspend differences in doctrine if they still believe in your mission and your vision, if they still have shared values, if you have a reputable reputation and or legacy there in your community. So you may disagree on certain nuances, but doctrine is not the end-all be-all when it comes to generosity. It really is last and least. But that's what I mean by affinity. So here's an exercise. You can take these 3 things, the RCA, relationships, affinity, and capacity, and assign them a numerical value from 0 to 5. 0 meaning it doesn't exist, 5 is as good as it will ever get. And if you take people in your church, even your staff members, volunteers, and different ones, and if you begin to grade them on this scale, what you will find is people who score 12, cumulative 12 or higher, they're probably your most generous givers and your most consistent givers. But anybody who scores a cumulative 6 or less, they're probably non-givers. Now, what we need to do through our stewardship strategies and our conversation and our approach is we need to focus on raising the RCA, the relationships, the capacity, and the affinity. We can't move the bubble much on capacity unless you hire them and give them a paycheck, right? But we can influence it some by helping them find margin. What we can do easily as a first step is invest more in the relationships and the affinity, being very clear on the mission and the vision and repeating that often. And so that's the strategy that we need to build around is the RCA. Now, we realize that everyone is not in the same place in their stage of life, and everyone's not in the same place on their spiritual journey. So we create environments and approaches unique to people in their stage of life and their spiritual place in their journey, right? We need to do the same thing when it comes to generosity, because not everybody is in the same place in their giving. Now, there are some tools out there like a giving ladder that you might have heard, and I think Sean's going to talk about that in a few minutes. And these giving ladders are great tools and great for communicating, but giving ladders are often developed by identifying the behaviors of a giver. What I want to talk about is the heart of the giver, and that's not always communicated in a giving ladder. So let's look at the heart of the giver at different stages in their giving. First of all, you have the non-giver or the reluctant giver. They may give, but it's very small and it's with a clenched fist. What's going on in their hearts a lot of times, their disposition is either fear or apathy. Now, yes, there's some people who are greedy, but what we find is the majority of non-givers aren't giving because they're greedy. The majority either are broke or they feel broke. Dave Ramsey talks about that a lot. They're overextended, living on 115% of their income. Or they're uninformed about your church, the cause, the mission, or they're just simply uninterested in whatever your cause is. But most people who are non-givers have willing hearts. They either lack the resources or they have bad habits that are conflicted with their willing heart. Now, an emotional giver is kind of the next level. This is where we all start out. We all start out as emotional givers, right? They're excited or they feel guilted and pressured. But an emotional giver always has some level of financial stress and anxiety. And this is where we tend to focus our attention because we're always trying to motivate and inspire and give the best story and give the greatest cause and have the best videos and the best images. And that gets exhausting to try to keep people up on that emotional level all the time. So some of us will resort to guilt and just tell them, hey, the Bible says that you're going to hell if you don't write a check, right? So we just go to the lowest level we can. But here's the thing, it's momentary giving. It is momentarily, a response that was caused by, the noble cause, the weeping child, the hurting family. Or they're motivated out of return on investment. The televangelist that says you give $10, you get $100 back, right? And so that's return on investment. Or if you give $10 a month, you're going to completely change this entire nation somewhere, right? And so that's return on investment. Or maybe you just gave a great sales pitch. And so they are emotionally responding to your great presentation. But again, that's emotional. It's a roller coaster. It's momentary. We want to move them to become thoughtful givers. And what's going on in the heart of a thoughtful giver is they're blessed. The market's been good. The business has been good. God's been good to them. And so they feel blessed and they feel grateful. But they may even feel obligated, like I got to pay it forward, right? Or I need to pay it back somehow. So what they do is they plan and they budget. They decide a determined amount, whether it's a fixed amount or whether it's percentage, and we start talking to these people about percentage giving, and they do it regularly and routine. But here's the thing. They're not guided so much by the spiritual dynamic as much as they are their budget. They're just looking at the budget and saying, what can I afford to give? And they're asking the question, what can I do? And that's a great place to start whenever you want to get off the emotional roller coaster. But the next level of sacrificial givers, what's going on in their heart is they are now developing this enormous amount of trust and confidence in God, trusting that God is their provider and confident that He is with them and for them and engaged in their financial life. So you'll see people at the sacrificial level are the tithers, 10%, and it goes up from there, right? And that requires some real life adjustments. It requires some real sacrifice to be able to sustain that level ongoing. And unlike the thoughtful giver who's looking at their budget, the sacrificial giver is now usually looking at biblical principles. They're now looking to see what God's word said and what Jesus said and what was taught and modeled through Scripture. So instead of asking and saying, hey, what can I do? They're now saying, what has God said? What has God instructed? What does Jesus ask? And then the last one is generational giver. Full of joy, joyful surrender, and contentment. They desire to make the maximum impact on the church's mission and vision, and they have a sense of calling. This is a spiritual gift that Paul talks about in Scripture, and they're looking at legacy, and they're asking themselves, what is God asking me to do? Not what He said generally in Scripture to everyone, but what do I feel the Holy Spirit whispering to me to do? And how effective can my life be in God's hands? What can God do through me? So just as we create these unique environments for different stages of life and different stages of faith, we need to have different approaches for people in different areas. So here are some of the approaches that I would recommend for people at each stage. For the non-giver and the reluctant giver, you need to help them take small steps of faith with their finances and emphasize the word faith, not just a transaction. It's a step of faith. And one of the ways we do that is we can invest in them. Things like financial peace that will help them get on a budget, help them deal with their condition of being broke or not having margin and all of that. And so however you do that, whatever class you offer or whatever opportunity and environment that you can help them with, that is great. But what you need to do is identify and acknowledge and really relate to their fears and their anxieties, that there may not be enough, that my heart is there, I just don't know that we have it to give. And so acknowledge that. And kind of jump into that with them. In fact, you may want to take steps with them. There are some who have done things like tithing challenges, and if you don't know what that is, that's where you say, hey, if you tithe 10% or whatever it is over 90 days, and at the end, if you're not better, we'll give it all back, okay? And let me caution against that because that really doesn't always breed a heart of generosity. It's a return on investment. There's also some real dangers and warnings there with the IRS if you ever are asked to give that back, so be careful. What I would suggest instead is a storehouse commitment. And what I mean is, if you go back in Scripture, you look at, when they were first taking all of these tithes and offerings and stuff, Old Testament and all, and even in the New Testament, they were giving it and giving to people who have need. So what you'd say is, look, I understand how frightening and anxious you may be over this, but if you start giving and when you start giving, understand we're in this with you. You're part of the church family. And if in the course of your life and relationship with us, if hard times happen, if something is a setback and it has you anxious and scared, let us know. We are the church family. This is the storehouse. We're not going to care for the community and not care for our own brothers and sisters. We are in this with you. And then hold true to that commitment. For the emotional giver, you need to share reports on how their giving is directly impacting lives in the community. But also celebrate consistency in giving, not just the amount. In other words, you may appreciate someone who gives you a big old check for several $1,000s, but do you appreciate the person who gives you $50 a week consistently? We want to celebrate that. So you encourage budgeted and percentage giving. That is how you will foster financial peace and confidence instead of the emotional roller coaster. And you want to encourage them to automate their giving, because we automate what's important. Most of us have automated our mortgage, automated our car payment. We've even automated our cell phone payments each month. And we automate what's important. So that doesn't rob it of its spiritual meaning and value. It actually places more spiritual meaning and value because we are automating our generosity and our response to God. For the thoughtful giver, help them connect their financial habits with their spiritual habits. Most don't see that. Now, the amount of money that a thoughtful giver, as they plan and give, it may go up and down based on their resources or their income. But you want to acknowledge the fact that they are committed, that they're making sacrifices and lifestyle adjustments to their income so that they can continue to give faithfully and consistently. And that is a strong indication of the amount of real estate that Jesus is taking up into their heart and the amount of commitment they now have to the Great Commission and the mission of the church. That is spiritual growth that they may not recognize because they're just focusing on financial transactions. And then the sacrificial giver. Encourage them to listen to God's whispers. In other words, we know what the Scripture says, but we also believe that the Holy Spirit and God still speaks to people and moves on people's hearts. So you're already doing what Scripture says, but I'm going to encourage you to lean in on the whispers of God, to lean into this calling and this gift that Paul recognized as a spiritual gift, the gift of giving. Lean into that and start looking at the ways that God is shaping you and forming you to leave a legacy. In other words, through your giving, things will be accomplished for generations that you may never see. Help them see the difference they're making now and the difference they are going to be making in the future through their giving. For the generational giver, you just want to help them maximize their impact. Big givers, we always are afraid that, big givers going to come in and want to make all the decisions of the church. And what we find is big givers do not want to make the decisions, but they do want to make a difference. And so you need to help them to maximize the difference they can make with their giving, and not just to the project they're giving, but also in inspiring others to give. And there's an appropriate way of doing this without, standing them on a platform or disclosing who they are or the amount they've given. But you need to find a way that's appropriate within the culture and context of your church to leverage their giving so that it is inspirational to other people. And that's what they want. They want their giving to invite others to engage in giving as well. Now, preaching and teaching on a platform is part of a stewardship system, but it is not the whole stewardship system. It is only a part, and it's foundational. Platform preaching and teaching, though, will primarily engage the emotional and the thoughtful giver. Okay? It's primarily that group. Now realize it's important. That's why we need to do series. That's why we need to talk about it on the platform, though some of us are adverse to that. We need to, because that's 50% of your income, that group. And if you add that to the non-givers, that's 85% of your congregation. So we need to have these conversations from the platform. But realize that sacrificial and generous givers are better engaged in more personal and intimate conversations. So they will sit there, and everything you're saying that, it kind of engages the emotional or the thoughtful giver, everything that's challenging the non-giver is going right past the sacrificial and the generous givers. They need to have more personal conversations. So your public platform appeals will never substitute for personal and private conversations, right? And then the strategies that produce maximum results for your church when it comes to generosity are unique for each church due to an existing culture. You see, every church in here, no matter how much we share in common, every church in here is unique. And every church in here has a unique history that got you to where you are. Every church in here has a unique culture around giving that already exists. And every single one of us as pastors and leaders, we are unique in our leadership style, in our capacity on handling these issues, on our comfort level on having conversations about money and finances and giving. So whenever we borrow from another church, and we want to borrow resources from each other, but what I see too often is when we borrow from another church, we're usually leaning too heavily on their branding, or too heavily on their messaging, or too heavily on their strategy, and we're overlooking or undervaluing their history, their existing culture, and all of those things that went into developing their strategy. So we can borrow some principles, but we need to be very careful about borrowing practices and just imposing them in our church. Now, I realize most of us, if not all of us, find it easier to talk about sex with our teenager than to talk about giving with our church, okay? I get that. But both of those conversations are important to the people we love that we want to help see grow and mature. So if generosity is God's plan for funding the mission and the vision He has for your church, and it is a key measure for spiritual growth, we need to have these conversations. We need to have continual conversations and a well-developed stewardship strategy. That's important for creating the culture. They're going to throw up a little chart here. I'm not expecting us to go through it. I just wanted you to glance at it because they will be having some resources that are available to you. Later, that electronically, they'll get these to you. And this just gives you an overview of some of the things I've said, and as you're developing the strategy to see these little processes and milestones that people move through. And again, anything I can ever do to help, feel free to call me. I'm here as a resource for you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Again, same format. Patrick will come back up and do Q&A in a bit. Sean, why don't you come on up? Sean C. is going to talk to us next. Sean, founding pastor of Athens Church, second partner church that was ever launched. And my very first lead pastor retreat, there was a moment where Sean stood up and addressed kind of all the other pastors and kind of shared from his heart and what God had been doing in his story. And for those of you that were there, it's probably one of my favorite moments in partnership history, just because it was such an authentic and open moment. And I know from talking to other leaders that were there that day, how much God used that to even maybe spark some journeys and some journeys of health. So thank you for that. And Sean's a great friend and a great guy. And he's also somebody who is one of the most strategic and pragmatic people when it comes to finances, and some of the stuff that they're doing at Athens Church, I really wanted you to hear about. So Sean, take it away.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that a bunch. Hey, y'all, this is the very last session before we go to lunch. So we do me a favor real quick, literally 10 seconds. Stand up right where you are. Give somebody a high five. Give them a Ricky Bobby, love that money if you need to. And then we're going to dive in. All right, you can grab a seat. That's awesome. Perfect. Hey, let me just tell you real quick. history of our church. So I was privileged to work on staff at North Point for 5 years before I helped start Athens Church. Moved to Athens, Georgia 14 years ago in the fall of '04. And we spent 5 years as a portable church, 5 years before we kind of started our first capital campaign. And then we found an old abandoned Walmart that had gone out of business. And we really had to stretch to reach to figure out how to make this happen. So it led us to our need for our first ever capital campaign. And many of you have been through that, or you're in a season where you're moving toward that. And you know what a daunting task that can be. We'd never been through that before. So, man, we looked for all the help we could get. And everybody is excited about a new facility. Everybody's excited about new spaces. Nobody's excited about a capital campaign. Nobody. The people leading it, the people participating in it, it just was like, come on, it's just incredible. So we decided that we wanted to come up with a theme or an idea that would help wrap people's hearts around what we really cared about. And so we really cared about our city. And so we wanted to wrap people's hearts around this idea of our city. So this idea of Athens, I love you was born. Now this concept, just so you know, this is a blast, started with a college girl that was part of our LDP program. 19-year-old girl came up with this Athens, I love you theme. And the idea was, we said, if we could only communicate, if God could only communicate one thing to the people of our city, what do we think God would say? We think God would say, Athens, I love you. We think that's the main thing that he would say. So we've been casting that vision for a long time. But not only so, as we moved into kind of fleshing out this campaign, we said we don't just want to focus this campaign on what the new facilities are or what the new things are that we're going to be able to buy or build or whatever, but we want to focus it on people's lives. And so we want to focus on individuals. So we decided to take these life change stories, and this was us back in 2010, as we were about 5 years into our church. These were some of the people's photos that had actually been baptized. And I'm going to show you another photo in a few minutes, but we actually had to use some of their photos twice so that we could make the image big enough. So it was, we were scraping for all the life change that we could find in those early days, if you know what that's like. So, but that was really important to us to stay focused on this idea of the individuals and the lives that we wanted to see change. Well, we got into that facility and renovated the old Walmart, and about 5 years later, the Walmart was attached to a shopping center, and we were able to buy the shopping center. It actually had some tenants in it at the time, so it really didn't cost us much. They were kind of paying the mortgage on it, but we decided it was time for us to move into the master plan phase of our facility, and so we did another major expansion about 5 years later, and we decided that we were going to stick with this same theme. We're going to stick with the same idea of Athens, I love you, because this is something that really had now become a bit of a motto for us as a church, that we wanted to be known for this in our city. And so, man, we've done all kind of branding around this. And obviously people like Jeff Henderson at Fort Gwinnett and many of you guys have figured out incredible ideas how to communicate to your city, that you're for your city, that you're not just for your church, that really your church exists for your city to serve the people of your city. And so that you guys have all been great at that. I'm going to throw in a quick caveat here real quickly. For those of you that are moving into a capital campaign season or see that as kind of the next step for us, I will tell you, there was a financial and banking consultant that made it all possible for us financially. We used a lady named Elisa Gaspar. There's probably other great people out there, but I'm telling you, she changed the game for us. And one of the first things she did for us was a strategic financial plan where she came in and looked at every penny our church has spent through the years and divided it up into these categories and said, look, if you want to be financially viable to make progress in the future, this is how you need to restructure your money. And that was some of the best money we have ever spent. And so we've stayed in relationship with her, and Rick introduced us to her and been an absolute game changer for us. So I want to make sure that I allude to that idea. So as we went into this next capital campaign 5 years later, one of the things that we noticed the first time around was a lot of people made pledges to the campaign. And so let's say they normally gave $1,000 a year and they pledged $1,000 to the campaign. You would think at the end of the year they're going to give $2,000. What they actually gave was about $1,500. And so they fulfilled their $1,000 of the campaign, but their normal giving went down to about $500. And I'm kind of making those numbers up. So we decided moving into this next season that we were going to focus on a one fund approach. And that may be information that you're real familiar with. But essentially we said, look, we don't want you to just pledge to a capital campaign. We want you to take a step in your generosity to the mission of this church, wherever you are. So if you're in that 50% that Patrick just mentioned that aren't giving, we want you to give your very first gift. If you're somewhere else along the line, we want you to take a step in your generosity. And that's where this giving ladder idea came available. And so I think we've got that image up here. Yeah. So on this was not our idea. We just kind of manipulated it for our purposes. But maybe what you're doing is giving your very first gift. We want to invite you to do so. Maybe you're moving to becoming an occasional giver, a percentage giver, a tither, or an extravagant giver. But we want you to take a step. And for us specifically, we said we want you to do this for 2 years. So there's a 2-year window that we're going to ask you to commit to taking this step. And we had a card that everybody filled out. You all have these during pledge seasons, but this just gives you an idea. We'll have all these resources available for you, by the way. But essentially it was, what do I give normally in a year? And the average person at your church, by the way, has no idea what they give in a year. They look back at the end of the year and try to figure that out. What's that expanded giving? What's that step going to be? And what's that total? And that's going to give you that 2-year total here. And then we actually had a big give Sunday about a month after the commitment Sunday. And he said, hey, if you've got any stored assets, people are essentially going to give to your church one of 2 ways. They're going to give out of money they've already got somewhere in their bank account or in savings, or they're going to figure out a way to work it into their budget. And so that's the only 2 ways that people have to give. So we're kind of accounting for both of those, if you will. So expanded giving, and if there's any stored assets, and that's kind of whatever their total commitment is going to be for that season of time. So let me tell you real quickly how we walked our kind of staff and leadership and all of our people through this commitment process in the capital campaign season. And step number 1, I think, is incredibly important. I think maybe the most important step. And that is, if we're going to ask our people to make sacrificial investments in the mission of our church, step number 1 is, what am I doing as a leader to sacrificially invest in our church? And I'll just tell you, during this window for us specifically, my wife and I made the largest financial commitment we've ever made to anything. And we said, we want to ask people to be generous to this. We've got to go first. And so I was fortunately able to stand up in front of my staff and my church and say, we're doing something we've never done before. And I eventually told the people exactly what it was and said, this is how important this is to us. So step 1 is, man, you better model the way and really do that in a way that you want other people to be able to follow. Step 2 is go to your staff. Go to the people that are most heavily invested in what you're doing. Guys, I don't know if you know this. I don't choose to know who gives to our church. I feel like I would hate people if I actually knew how little they actually gave. But others of you feel like you can handle that information. That's awesome. But I went to our staff and said, look, I don't know how much you give, but here's what I want you to understand. If we're on this staff, we tithe, we automate our giving. That's what we do. So if you want to work here, that's what it's all about for us. And, you know, over a period of time, everybody has gotten in alignment with that. And now we say that to new people as they're coming in. Hey, if you're interested in working here, this is how it works. And so leading for us, we moved into the fall before this 2-year window of time. We started first buying out, figuring out what we're going to do, then working with our staff and our elders and our leadership. I asked the elders, same thing. Man, there's no way you can be an elder here and not tithe to this church. Like, you've got to be invested, because you have the greatest authority here. Then we moved into our next leadership group. So that's all of our small group leaders, our coaches, you know, all throughout our ministry areas. Ask all those volunteers, hey, we need you to commit to this. We need you to lead the way. You're a leader around here. We need you to model. And then as we moved into the new year, we actually did a 4-part series on this Athens, I Love You vision. At the culmination of that, we invited everybody to fill out one of these cards and to be kind of in the process for 2 years for us. So that was kind of our process of casting a vision for this whole idea, starting with our leadership, working our way to all the people, and then asking people to commit for 2 years. Now, that was all incredibly helpful, and some of that is not new information to any of you. But what I want to tell you in our final few minutes together is I want to tell you 2 things that we've done that have been absolute game changers for us financially, okay? So once we went through developing a vision for our city, casting it to our people, focusing it around one fund, just give to the mission, take a step, the next thing that we decided to put all of our emphasis and energy on that summer was on automating your giving. We focused so much attention and so much energy on automation. I'm telling you, people at our church were sick of hearing automation. The staff did not want to talk about it anymore because we talked about automate as much as possible. And so as we moved into that first emphasis, that first summer, we decided that if this is what we want people to do, then we're going to reward it. Y'all, this was so simple. But we developed our own coffee brand, an Athens I Love You coffee brand with a local coffee company in town. And so you can get a can of coffee that's an Athens I Love You coffee, and we'll give all the money to our Be Rich partners that we make off of it. But we decided that if you'll automate your giving, that we'll give you a can of coffee. When this first came out, that sounds so simple, right? It cost us like $7 for a can of coffee. We had almost 100 family units sign up to automate their giving for a free can of coffee. It was unbelievable, but it was just one simple way to reward that action step. as we moved into the fall, we wanted to reward this opportunity again. And so we do financial peace every fall and spring at our church. And we said, if you'll sign up for, excuse me, it might have actually been in the winter, whenever it was. We said, if you'll sign up for to automate your giving, we will give you access to financial peace for free, which back then was $100. I think it's still somewhere around there. And so we made a $100 investment in this. And guys, just from a purely financial vantage point, that made sense to us because we had run the numbers. The difference for us between non-automated givers and automated givers was literally about 4x. Their annual contributions was about a 4 times difference between an average non-automated giver and an automated giver. So that $100 sacrifice was more than worth it. Actually, we found out the first time around, I think we had about, I don't know, I want to say it cost us about $4,000 to pay for all of the financial peace things. We had one giver who increased their giving more than $5,000 in a given year, and they more than offset all of that cost. But the idea was rewarding this concept of automated giving, and that became a huge, huge deal for us. We actually still now do a 90-day automation challenge. Patrick alluded to the 90-day tithe challenge. We do a 90-day automation challenge, and yeah, I don't know how it'll work with the IRS, but I think we've only had to give it back maybe once. But nevertheless, we say, look, if you'll automate your giving for 90 days, the end of that 90 days, if you regret it for whatever reason, feel like it was a terrible decision or you're in a bad place, we'll give you all the money back. And in the same way, we create a new reward system every time somebody does that. So it might be a $25 gift card to our Athens I Love You store, or it might be some other incentive. And man, that has been an absolute game changer for us. I just can't tell you what a huge deal that was. But let me tell you the last and maybe best idea that we ever came across. So as we started moving into this process, we had everybody kind of pledge the system. We'd moved to focus on automation. I asked our team to run a report. I want to know, of all the volunteers in our organization, I want to know how many of them automate. How many of them currently automate? You serve here. Do you automate your giving? We've been talking about this for months and months now. And so we ran a report to see where people were in automation. And I was shocked that tons of our volunteers had not automated their giving. I mean, I felt like we'd been talking about this, you know, it was just driving people crazy, but they still had not taken this step. So I decided to invite my staff into helping carry some of this load and helping them feel some of this responsibility. So we created a volunteer automation contest with our staff, literal contest. Okay, so here's how this worked. You found out exactly how many volunteers you have. You have 100 volunteers in your area, let's say. Do you want to put that table up? This won't be incredibly helpful, but we'll give you a visual of this and you'll see the idea. Just look at the top portion just for a second. Here's all our ministry areas listed on the left. If you go 2 columns over, it says number of adult household volunteers. That's all the volunteer households you have. And then the second column, go back over the left, that's how many of those currently automate. So then you can see the gap. You can see where you are. And so we said this is going to be a school year contest, a 9-month contest. During this 9 months, if you can convert 27 family units in your ministry area to become automated givers, they might even already be givers. You're just asking them to change the way that they give to become automated. But if you'll do that in the individual, let's just assume this table right here is our student ministry table. If you get 27 as a team, not individually, but as a team, if you get 27, every single one of you, we will give you a free week off of work, and we will give you a free place to stay in the mountains or at the beach or at the lake. We'll give you a free week's vacation for your family. And the way that I managed that in terms of the spaces, it actually ended up not costing the church anything. I went to an outside donor outside of our church who kind of helped us start Athens Church. I said, can you give us like, I don't know, $5,000 or $10,000 really to pay for the cleaning fees? Because I went to all the people in our house that have lake houses, beach houses, mountain houses, all those people that you know that wish they would let you borrow their place every now and then. And I said, hey, would you be willing to give us 1 free week for our staff this next year? And several of those people said yes. And so I took that place, whatever was free and available, and then we said, we'll pay the cleaning fee for it, and then we're going to make it available to our team. It turned out that at least 5 of our ministry areas actually reached that goal. And it was a huge deal. And let me tell you, you're talking about motivation. Our staff was motivated. They had not been super motivated before to get involved in this, but all of a sudden we'd invited them into something and incentivized them enough that now they genuinely were talking to their volunteers. I mean, they're having face-to-face conversations at lunch. Hey man, do you currently automate your giving? We'd like to help you do that. And then they got super creative on how they inspired people to give. to automate as well. And so it increased the level of creativity in an unbelievable way. So we're probably in the not too distant future going to try something like this again, because it was such a big deal, and it really got everybody involved and kind of everybody carrying the weight. So that was one of our great tricks. So I want to, in the last couple minutes here, I want to just tell you a couple other things we do. Al alluded to something earlier that we've learned along the way, and that is just our giver appreciation process. Many of you already have systems like this, but we learned that after a person gave 3 times, after their third gift, their likelihood of being an ongoing giver was much greater. So we've now created a process where I personally write them a note and thank them the first time they give. The second time they give, our financial person sends them a letter, and it kind of explains all the financial processes in our church and how we have accountability and how we have an audit and all that. The third time they give, our stewardship director writes them a thank you note, and we actually send them a gift. We send them this painted print. There's a cool local artist in our city who's got a painted print of Athens Church, and it's about yay big, and it comes in this tube and shows up at their house. It's so cool, so unexpected, but that's just after their third gift, our way of saying, hey, thank you so much. And then if you automate your giving, we also send you a $10 gift card for our Athens I Love You store that you can spend at Athens Church. So you can get a t-shirt, a cup of coffee, a mug, a journal, whatever that you want to get from there. And so that's something that we have as an ongoing process. So first, second, third time givers, and then when you become an automated giver, we want to reward what we want repeated. And so that has been huge for us. One last thing, we are big Financial Peace fans. And so we've been doing Financial Peace fall and spring. You can just sign up for it on a Sunday afternoon and go through in a setting, honestly, just like this. But we intentionally did not do it this fall, and we've been waiting to do this for years. But in the spring of 2019, we're going to, as we start the year, we're going to do a 5-week series on the idea of momentum in life. So essentially, these goals and things you want to achieve in life, like how do you ever get there? And so we're going to talk to people about how there is this concept of momentum. When a lot of people are moving the same direction, man, you can jump on board and it helps you achieve some of the things that you want to achieve in life. At the end of that, we're going to invite every single person in our church to go through Financial Peace University. And so every small group, we're not giving them the choice. February and March, you're doing Financial Peace. That's what you do as a group. And anybody else that wants to do it, you can come here on Sunday afternoon, and we're going to put you in a setting like this and connect you to a small group type environment, and we're all going to do Financial Peace together. Wambaland, Upstreet, Transit, Inside Out, all of them at some point in time in that window are going to do something on stewardship. They're going to do something on generosity. They're going to do something around finances. Every single part of our church, Ramsey's team calls it kind of a momentum approach. But that's something we've been waiting to do for a long time. But we've intentionally waited to do that until we're not in a capital campaign. And so we've waited. Number one, we're in a healthy place financially, but also we don't need anything from you. And so we want this for you. Ramsey's been saying forever, people don't give because they can't give. Well, we're going to try to help in that aspect of their lives and really make a deposit in them. Here's the last thing I want to say. All of these efforts for us have paid off unbelievably well. And I'll just give you a quick visual. Put that next slide back up there if you don't mind. So this was our image from 2010 when we were first getting started in this. Let me just tell you real quickly financially. From 2014 to 2017, when we started kind of moving people through this process, I don't have the 2018 numbers, we grew about 14% numerically as a church. Our 2014 number, 2017 number, grew 14%. Our financial difference in that same exact window was 72%. So our difference in our income went from sub 4 million to, in 18, will probably be 7.3, 7.4, something like that. Guys, this made a major, major difference. Inviting people to take these steps, the emphasis on automation, getting our teams involved, leading their people, it made a huge difference. But as I mentioned from the very beginning, we all only care about money because we care about lives being changed. right? We're not just interested in money for money. We're not a for-profit organization. We want resources because, as Andy has said for years, most of us have more vision than we have resources, right? But the more resources God provides for us, man, the more we can reach people, the more creative things we can do, the more we can make a difference. So I'll go ahead and put up the next image. This was our 2017 image, just to show you a difference in the window of time of the lives that have been changed at the church. And for what it's worth, we've got about 250 people to add to that image that aren't a part of it yet. And so way more than I'm excited about just the bottom line difference. Man, this is why our church started. And we are so incredibly grateful. So yeah, that's the only tips and tricks we know. So come on back up, man. Come on.
All right, I think the microphones are going to be passed around. Anybody have a first question for either Sean or Patrick? Just kind of say your name and maybe where you minister. Yes.
Hi, Sean. Michelle from San Antonio.
Hey.
When you say automated giving, how do you track when the credit cards expire or on the back end system and how people get back into that? Are you tracking that, and can you tell me about it?
Yeah, so we actually we've now hired a stewardship director, and so who's managing that for us personally. And so anytime somebody's schedule expires for whatever reason, he knows it, and he's following up with that person individually, specifically if it's something like a credit card expiring, to help them kind of figure out. And he'll actually go in and reset it up for them if they give him access to do that. And so he's following every single individual automated schedule and just paying attention to, and some people just set up schedules for a certain period of time, right? A lot of schedules are not set up forever. And so maybe they're just set up for 12 months. And if it gets to the end of that 12 months, he's at least paying attention to that. And if that person's still engaged, he's finding the appropriate ways to follow up with them relationally. It's a good question. One thing I didn't say, by the way, let me just go ahead and show you real quick. We decided if you automate your giving, you can't give when the buckets pass, right? And I don't know if anybody gives at your church when the buckets pass. So we decided to create a card that we put in the seat backs. It's a little bigger than this. I'm just kidding. This is a full-size print. But this, it's real small. But this allows people to give in the moment. So we say when it's time for the offering, hey, if you give online, we'd love for you to grab the red card that's in front of you. On the back of it is a place if you want to write a prayer request or celebrate something God's doing, that's great. And if you're interested in automating your giving, just write your email address on this, drop it off, and we'll send you instructions this week on how you can begin automating your giving. And so this red card will be part of the electronic resources and stuff available. So,
Any other questions?
I had a question for Patrick. You coming from radio? Sorry, I'm Grant from Detroit. You mentioned you have those personal conversations with your sacrificial and your generational givers. How do you identify those people and initiate the conversation? With that, we've tried to identify that. We talk to our top givers, but at least in our context with blue-collar community, medium incomes, 40,000, those are the people that are the most tapped out and don't have much margin. So how do you initiate those, identify and initiate those conversations?
Well, if you have, hopefully you've got some way of tracking giving data, as you know, because you're giving year-end giving or quarterly giving reports or year-end giving reports. So you'll kind of see where certain people are. You can look at your community, and if you say, okay, here's what we know is median household income, so you can kind of see what percentages are there. And so there's multiple ways of kind of identifying who it is. When I say personal, I don't mean everything's going to be just one-on-one, me and a cup of coffee and that person. But I mean that they need to be taken out of a platform like this. In fact, what Sean had said, we had said this over and over and over, automate, automate, automate. I can't believe they're not automating, because there's some people, we just have this tendency to exempt ourselves from the mass conversation. When he equips the staff to now start having conversation, he's taking it to a personal, intimate level. So you have to find a way of doing that, whether it's through your small groups and you do, kind of deploy your leaders and staff to have these conversations, or whether it is new people coming to your church. And at some point, hey, we're introducing you to the values of our church. And one of the things I want you to know, guys, I'm surprised how many unchurched people come to our church, there forever, don't give. And when we say our church operates 100% off the generosity of people, and they go, I didn't know that. I thought there was a big organization somewhere. They have no idea. So you have that conversation with a smaller group, round table, 20 people, 25 people, or it could be just a handful. Again, it could be one-on-one now when you get to the generational type givers. And you're not there to say, hey, I need more money. I mean, there may be some gap you need to close. But what you're there to say is you're a difference maker. You are a champion giver. What we do at our church and the lives you see, the pictures in this would not happen because, with a handful of people change their giving habits. You're one of those. I just want to say thank you. And can I come alongside of you to help you maximize that for greater impact and influence to encourage others to give? And one of the ways that happens, the approach that Sean has is, again, an approach that I recommend. Before you ever go public and say, hey, our goal is to raise $2 million, you should probably have half of that already committed or raised. And so those huge givers like that, those high capacity givers, when you stand before a church, I remember the first time, and our church was much smaller. We're trying to raise something that was, almost 3 times our annual income. That number sucks the life out of the room for the average person. So when you throw a number up there, and then you can say, and by the way, we already have half of this raised and committed. There's thunderous applause. There's an exhale. There's a we can do this. So that's how the generational givers are inspiring other givers without ever having to be stood on the platform and told exactly what they've done.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, that's good. Anything up? That one right there.
Hey, I'm Seth from Indiana. Sean, I have a question for you regarding automated giving. How do you increase somebody's automated giving over time? So obviously, when they commit initially, you're hoping that over time our percentage will increase. What do you guys do to address that? Because since it's automated, I'm not thinking about it on a daily basis.
Honestly, I would say that's a huge growth area for us that we haven't figured out. I think that's something we need to work on because we've got a lot of people automating at a pretty low level. And so the fact that they've taken that step is a big deal for us, but we haven't done a great job yet of figuring out how to take that step. But I do think something like this ladder and building that into our more consistent conversation is something that we need to address. But yeah, we're not quite there yet, so that's a great question.
Can I jump in on that and tackle?
Yes.
Give you, he talked about doing a one fund. One funds are excellent because, and again, that's a generational thing too. One fund's not for everybody. If you have an older congregation, they like the typical, here's my regular giving and here's my above and beyond. If you have a younger congregation, they love the one fund. It's like, a mutual fund in giving. I give to one place and y'all just do it. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about, the one fund, I'm giving this one place and then it's automated all the way across. What's beautiful about that is when you have non-givers or you have those emotional givers and they're starting, so somebody who gave nothing last year has now committed to $1,000 and they're doing that for 2 years. At the end of that 2 years, you need to have a conversation, a platform conversation, and then some follow-up small conversations because now that's the new normal for them. Mm-hmm. So you can say, in fact, can you throw that card back up that Sean had? No, the card.
Right after
that you
the
fill
ladder,
out.
the image right after the ladder.
That's a great exercise to work off of. And
there you go.
yeah, okay. So for instance, what I normally give in a year, you've got people, the answer is 0, or it was $500. Well, my expanded giving is I'm going to give $1,000 this year, so you're going to total that up, and that's going to be $1,500 times 2, that's $3,000. That's now the new normal. So if you've had this campaign or you have this emphasis, and it doesn't have to be a capital campaign, it can just be an emphasis, right? Mm-hmm. When you come back out with this card, you say, hey, what do I normally give in a year? Well, it's now $1,500. You see? Mm-hmm. That's a new normal for them. So then now what's my expanded giving? Well, I'm going to increase that $500. So it's a matter of, again, developing a system, not an event. And, that may be where you're at now is how do we now pick that conversation back up for the automated givers and to have a card and say, hey, what was your giving last year? We're just going to challenge as we all take this momentum step forward. So there is, again, a regular part of the system and the conversation where we are all together looking at what we did last year and what we feel like God is leading us or what we feel like our habits are adjusting to for the next year.
That's great.
That's great.
I love that.
Chris.
So, Chris from Charlotte. Sean, I can speak to this, man. You've done such a great job on this from the beginning of keeping the focus on it. I was actually with you guys not too long ago sitting in your service, and I came back and I was talking to our production guy about this. I thought you guys did a really good job in your piece in the offering spot. It was obviously vision, but you did a really good job with the videos of instructing people on specific behaviors, like not just, hey, information, here's what we want you to do, but you were actually, as you were talking, this video was rolling that was showing them how to do it. Click here, do this. And I'm just curious, and I know you're super intentional in this. You know, you read Influencer, and it talks about addressing these specific behaviors. Was that intuitive, or was that a strategic? You guys behind the scenes said, "Hey, we got to stop telling people what to do. We got to show them." And are there other examples of that? Where are there other places where you've realized it's people need more specific, like, hey, here's how to do this. Here's what to download. And I thought it was great, by the way, what you guys did.
Thanks, man. I mean, that card definitely, it was kind of the first, initial step. But you actually caught us, Chris, I'm almost positive, in the season where we were converting to PushPay. Yeah. And so we were changing our automation, our giving system. And so specifically in that window of time, we felt the need to really walk people through exactly what the steps were. So that was the purpose of the video and whatnot. We're using PushPay now, and we absolutely love it. If you don't use it, when a person goes to give on PushPay, the natural default option is an automated schedule. That's the first thing it's going to offer them. And so PushPay is really structured in such a way that they really want to encourage automated giving. So that was specifically during that window. Right now, when we come to the giving moment, we just specifically say, hey, the easiest and best way to give is online. If you go to acgiving.com, that's acgiving.com, that's going to send you straight to our PushPay link. And my younger son, I was actually with him the other day, and he had made a few dollars, and so he was going in to give, and he had done the first time PushPay thing where he'd set it up. And I was with him the next time. He doesn't have a recurring schedule. And it literally took him 10 seconds to give. I mean, it was so crazy easy. And that was the first time I'd been able to experience that, because we do an automated schedule. But so specifically, Chris, in that season, I think we were trying to be really intentional about what the steps are. But I don't think we do that very consistently. But yeah, thanks for your.
Can we thank Patrick and Sean for sharing? Thanks, guys. All right, so we're going to have some time for you guys to talk at tables just about what this is looking like in your ministry context, and there should be some questions that guide that. So let's take a few minutes and just share together.